our heritage. Good evening and welcome to our heritage lecture for October, the lost covered bridges of the Delaware River. And thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Allison Summer-Sayre. I'm the Executive Director of the Delaware River Greenway Partnership, DRGP. We work to preserve and enhance the natural, cultural, and recreational resources of the lower Delaware River in New Jersey and Pennsylvania. Part of our mission is education. Our presentation tonight explores the history of the wooden covered bridges that were once up and down the Delaware River. Thank you to Scott Bomboy for sharing his expertise with us tonight. Our Scott Bomboy is a journalist, author, and historian with a special interest in our local area. He is the author of Wooden Treasures, the story of Bucks County's covered bridges, and the American Hometown book series about Perkasie. Bomboy is also chair of the Bucks County Covered Bridge Society. As a journalist, he received 5 Edward R. Murrow Awards in television, and he currently is the editor of the National Constitution Center. There will be time for Q&A at the end of the presentation, facilitated by my colleague Cindy Kunis. Feel free to submit questions as we go along, and Cindy will compile them. Now I'll hand it over to Scott.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be online and talk about one of my favorite topics, obviously covered bridges. And the way I'll go through my slideshow deck, it'll probably take about 30 minutes, maybe a little longer. We can do a little Q&A after that. But my backstory is I'm a journalist, I'm a historian. I decided to go back to grad school 8 years ago to get my master's in history, even though I'm currently working in the history field. And one of my 2 grad school projects were the covered bridges of Bucks County. And a lot of that was the Delaware River covered bridges. So we'll go through what I learned in my book research and my master's program. We'll do a little more on the 7 bridges that were north of Bucks County on the Delaware and Pennsylvania. And then we'll do the Q&A. So I'm going to get my slideshow going here. Make sure we can see that. And that's my book. It came out 4 years ago, Wooden Treasures. And there were 51 covered bridges in Bucks County. I tracked down pictures of all 51 and did a lot of research. And how I got involved with covered bridges is I actually got married at a covered bridge back in 2006 in Perkasie. And I've been working on the preservation project for that for the past 6 years. We're actually starting rehab work in 2 weeks after it was damaged by Hurricane Ida. So I really had to become like a subject matter expert in covered bridges. And when I do talks, I always ask 2 questions because someone will ask me that question. And the first question I always hear is, why are covered bridges covered? And there's basically 4 answers in the slideshow: to calm down animals, to keep the bridge's deck dry, to create a shelter from bad weather, all of the above. And the actual correct answer is to keep the deck dry. Back in 1820, when Ithiel Town, one of the original architects of covered bridges, did his patent, he said a bridge would last 6 to 7 times longer if the deck was covered. The other question I usually ask is, where was America's first covered bridge? Not everybody knows the answer to this. Bridgeville, New York, Easton, Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, or Trenton, Morrisville. And that is the first covered bridge in a painting from the early 1810s, I think, actually, after the bridge was built. That is the bridge in Philadelphia, Palmer's Bridge, which was actually currently at 30th and Market Street in Philadelphia on the Schuylkill River. And a third bonus question I have in here is, why are there no covered bridges left on the Delaware? Fires, floods, progress, or all of the above? The answer is D. There are plenty of fires, more floods, and progress certainly had a big role in the disappearance of the bridges on the Delaware. Before they had covered bridges on the river, the only way across really was the ferry system. This is an etching of a ferry on the Schuylkill River near Philadelphia. The Delaware would have been exactly the same. There's usually families that were prominent that owned the locations of the ferry. They had a hotel there usually, and they would charge tolls to move people, goods, carriages, whatever, across the river. The problem with ferries is they don't run on a regular basis because of weather. So the idea was in the early 1800s to start putting bridges across rivers. But the only really good bridge technology at that time were stone bridges, which were not practical. So the inventive Americans of the time period came up with the idea of the covered bridge. Now, Palmer was the first person to build a covered bridge in the United States. He was from New England. He did a wooden truss bridge on an island in New England. I think it was New York, actually. And he was hired to come down by the movers and shakers in Philadelphia to build this bridge across the current 30th and Market Street. And you'll see on the left is what he finished initially. There's a bridge. It's got big piers. There's no cover. And Judge Richard Peters, who was the financier for the project, insisted that a cover would be made on the bridge. On the right-hand side is Owen Biddle, the carpenter, painted fake stonework on it and then paneled the bridge so it was enclosed, which made it the first covered bridge in the United States. Bucks County itself, between 1806 and 2024, had 51 covered bridges. 12 survive today, 10 are original, 2 are replicas. And you'll see on the map up there, the Delaware River, there's a lot of bridges on or near the Delaware because that was the main concourse way into Philadelphia from Bucks County. Now, the Delaware River, I found out doing some research for this presentation, had at least 19 covered bridges, starting from Coshocton up north down to Trenton. You'll see there's a large concentration in Bucks County. There's 11 in Bucks County, and then Northampton has 2 or 3, I believe, and then Pike and Wayne have the other bridges. Now, in the Bucks County Delaware River Bridge Network, there were 11. The first was built in 1806 by Theodore Burr. That was the second covered bridge in the United States. The last bridge was built in 1861, Upper Trenton. If you know the Trenton area, it's the Calhoun Street Bridge location. And the last covered bridge in service over the Delaware was in Lumberville in Bucks County in 1945. Now, this is the Burr's Trenton Bridge, which is really, really innovative for its time period. He was out surveying the location. He was also from New England. He knew his bridges, and they were building the piers, and they had a major flood, and the water topped the piers. So he jacked this bridge up higher so it would survive the flooding. And what he found out as an empirical bridge builder is he couldn't really cover the sides because it would create a wind shear problem. So this is really futuristic, really, for 1806 when it was built. It's at the current location of the Trenton Makes Bridge, and some of the pier work is actually used for that current bridge. Burr patented his technique with the arch, and this is the most common bridge structure used in Pennsylvania currently. It's called a paneled king post arch design, so the arch carries a lot of the weight down to the ends. The king post keeps the frame or the truss of the bridge sturdy. Now, these bridges were all privately owned on the Delaware. At that point, there was really no tax system to pay for bridges. The people who owned the ferries basically raised money various ways. They set up shareholder corporations to run the bridges. And their theory was, we'll finance the bridge, we'll charge tolls, we'll make enough money basically to pay dividends. It's all well and good unless you have some kind of physical problem like a flood or a fire in the river. This slide is really a stereoscope from 1874. If you're familiar with Lambertville and New Hope, this is the top of Goat Hill looking up the river toward New Hope. The New Hope Bridge was built in 1814. It was nearly 1,000 feet long. So this is a big wooden structure. It was designed and built by a guy named Louis Vernbog, who was another famous bridge builder. It was very innovative because it used a combination of wrought iron and wood in the structure, and it was really very far ahead of its time. Yardley had a covered bridge. And if you're familiar with Yardley, you know where the Yardley Inn is. If you look out in the river, there's like a memorial for a war memorial. That is the location of the Yardley Old Bertha Bridge. This another large bridge close to 1,000 feet on the downside of the Delaware. In the upper part of the Delaware in Bucks County, this is an example of a shotgun bridge. So that's Milford, New Jersey on the one side, Upper Black Eddy on the other. And what they did with a shotgun bridge is they built basically a lane divider through the center. So basically they could have traffic going either way. This bridge, I think the mill is still there. It was very innovative for its time. The Lower Trenton Bridge, Calhoun Street Bridge, was the last bridge built on the Delaware in Bucks County. It was built in 1861 or 1862, I believe. And this was also a Burr arch. You'll see the arch actually extending into the pier work there. This was lost about 20 years later in a fire when someone dropped a cigar on the bridge. Now, the river has really dictated the life and death of the bridges on the Delaware, and there are three major floods. These are two of them. When you hear the 100-year flood, what I always tell groups is the 100-year flood in the Delaware is every 20 or 30 years. These are the legitimate 100-year floods, which happen every 50 years, basically. The bridges freshet of 1841 took out most of the bridges on the Delaware. The Great Pumpkin Flood of October 1903 took out 4 of the 8 remaining covered bridges on the Delaware in Bucks County. And the 1955 flood from Hurricane Diane was actually more destructive than either of these floods. This is an actual picture of the Washington Crossing covered bridge about to be wiped out in the flood of 1903. If you look at the far left-hand side, the water is up to the bottom of the bridge. There's a gap on the right-hand side. This is one of the 4 bridges that was not replaced. So for a brief period of time, the locals had to go back to the ferry system until new metal bridges were built as replacements, or a couple were repaired, but most of them, the ones that were destroyed, were new modern bridges. And you'll see in the background the actual pier work of the Frenchtown or Eulerstown Bridge, where they had to bring back ferry service for 6 months to a year. One of the last bridges on the Delaware in Bucks County was the Center Bridge. The Center Bridge was did not sustain damage in the October 1903 pumpkin flood. However, it had issues in the 1920s. Someone kept trying to set it on fire in 1923. They would put the fire out, and the last time it happened, they went out, put the fire out. The following week, lightning struck the bridge. And this is Redfield's famous painting that's in the Missioner Museum, the burning of Center Bridge. And you'll see some firemen on the left-hand side actually in part of the bridge work over the canal, trying to put the fire out. They later went into the water, and the crowd had to rescue the firemen. This is the last covered bridge that was in Bucks County on the Delaware. It's the Lumberville Bridge, if you know the Lumberville area. It lost one of its spans in the 1903 flood, so they basically put in Warren Truss, or I think it's a Warren Truss metal bridge in. And this is unusual because it's 3 different bridge designs. If you look at the right-hand side, the lower left, you'll see little pegs or little knobs in the bottom of the bridge. That's a burr truss. The one on the right side is called a town lattice truss, and there's a metal truss. This was in road service until 1944, and it was not doing good. And basically at that point, the Joint State Bridge Commission closed the bridge down. Now, the Delaware River had other covered bridges above Bucks County, and this is actually the Portland-Columbia Bridge, one of the more photographed bridges that you're going to see, and if you see it in postcards and different things, and a really unique history. And the Upper Delaware had at least 7, probably 8 covered bridges. I'm still researching the Dingman's Ferry Bridge, which may have existed in the 1840s and 1850s. The other ones are documented, and the Milford Bridge is heavily documented. There's no pictures of that, but there are pictures of the other bridges. Now, Timothy Palmer, when he was finished doing his bridge in Philadelphia, he already had a contract to do a bridge in Easton, PA. And you'll notice that the bridges are really similar. He came up the river while they were doing the carpentry work on his first bridge. He started the project in Easton. The project in Easton took maybe 8 years to do. There were problems financing the first part of the project to put piers in the river. They ran out of money. And what they did, the investors, is they got permission from the state to do a lottery and give out prizes as a way of fundraising in addition to selling shares. So they finally got the business part of it together. They brought up Palmer. He finished this, I believe, in October of 1806. And it was a very, very structurally sound bridge. It was the 3rd covered bridge in the U.S. Now, this diagram is from a book from the 1890s, a bridge construction book. It compares the 2 internal structures of the Schuylkill Bridge and what's called the Highway Bridge at Easton, or the Easton Delaware Bridge. And you'll see the truss work is almost identical. He's using arches. He has basically what are called king posts, which are the verticals. It's a very flexible form of bridge construction, given the fact that he was not a trained engineer and he did everything empirically or through observation. But he took a lot of the lessons he learned in Philadelphia and applied them to the bridge in Easton. So unfortunately, after this project, he stopped building bridges and he went up to become a tax collector up in New England. But these are really historic, very far advanced bridges. And the one thing about Burr's Bridge and Palmer's two bridges is they were never destroyed in a flood or a fire or anything. They were taken out of service because of the need for train and trolley transportation. If you were in Easton back in that time period, this is what you would have seen when you approached the bridge. It had two lanes. Basically, it was says erected by Palmer. Some people call it the Palmer Bridge, actually. And this remained in service. You'll see some tracks on there until the 1890s when they needed something more structurally sound for trolleys. And this is another view of the Easton Bridge. You'll see it looks very similar to the bridge you did in Philadelphia, Palmer. They did not pay for the fake stone painting facade work. It has windows on there, and there's different theories about why bridges have windows. One theory is it's for the view. Bridges had a lot of livestock, especially horses, and they needed also a way to dispose of the horse manure. So that's another theory about why they had windows. But basically, this is a near duplicate of the bridge he did in Philadelphia. This was never lost. Right here in this picture, it's in the middle of an ice flow. It survived that. It remained in place until it was taken out of service because of the need for a better transportation system on the bridge. That's the replacement bridge. So if you know Easton, you know James Madison Porter III's Northampton Street Bridge. Very, very innovative design, very unique design. Pretty advanced for its time period in the 1890s. The other bridge north of Easton that's photographed a lot and seen in various things is the Portland Columbia Bridge. It's also known as the Coca-Cola Bridge, even though it did carry other advertisements. At one point, the company that owned it before it was taken over by the two states, Pennsylvania and New Jersey, they put paid advertising on the bridge. So Coca-Cola was a sponsor. There was another sponsor that would paint the bridge. There's one thing you can notice in this picture. If you look at the roof line is not even. That's a function of the piers being slightly off. So the piers are not actually level. And that can lead to something called a humpback bridge. So this bridge had some minor condition issues, but it remained in service until 1955, until 53 as a traffic bridge, and then as a pedestrian bridge for a brief time. Now, the Portland Columbia Bridge, these are two really great views of it. One on the Jersey side, I'm not quite sure what the other side is. And you can see it has the gates. Basically, if it were still doing tolls at this point, I think it's toll free. And on the other side, you'll see basically this is probably from the early 1950s before it was lost in a flood. So it's also interesting because there are several pictures of the inside of the bridge. On the right-hand side is a picture with the longtime toll keeper who was there through at least 50 years, and he actually outlasted the bridge. And on the left-hand side is a picture from Professor Nelson Davis from Bucknell, who was an early bridge photographer for 1936. And you'll see the sheer amount of wood and truss system, the arches, basically the plank deck. Here's all the top bracing. On the left-hand side, you'll see a fire bucket, just in case there's a problem. And the bridge was actually very well built. Another bridge up the river from that is Riverton Belvedere. And I don't know a lot about this bridge. I've done some research. The picture on the left is from a photographer whose work is held by the Trenton State Museum, and they just did an exhibit of his work. He lived in Belvedere, and that's actually a glass plate negative photo. And the right-hand side is basically a picture of fully clothed people bathing in the river and doing recreational stuff. What you'll notice with this design is you can see the outline of the Burr truss and the actual side panel, which is very unusual. And that was also lost in the Pumpkin Flood in 1903. Up in Narrowsburg was another bridge. This is actually It's called a Hal truss. If you look at the insides, they're basically X's, and that's a later design. It was really modified more for trains, even though it was used for covered bridges. It's a Hal truss with an arch supporting it on the side. In the top picture, something obviously happened to that bridge at some point. It occasionally there would be wind issues or the occasional tornado that would hit a bridge. And it's got something going on the right-hand side. You can see the little points on top for the Hal truss. What's interesting about that is if you look at the two sides of the bridge, they're not stone abutments. They're actually using the sides of the river as natural abutments to hold the bridge in place. Coshocton and Damascus, that was the last one in Pennsylvania up north. Basically, this is a really early bridge. What we're looking at on the left is probably a reconstructed version of the prior bridge. It was built by someone associated with Theodore Burr indirectly. Salmon Wheat and also another guy, Reuben Field, was involved with that bridge who worked with Burr. So it's got the truss work. On the right-hand side is basically an etching from probably the 1830s of the bridge. This was also replaced in 1902. In my research, I run into these bridges occasionally. They're basically railroad covered bridges. So they're hybrid metal wood. They usually have wood sides. They may or may not have a wood roof on them because when your train goes through the railroad bridge back then, they were coal trains. So sometimes they would take the wooden roof off. This is actually across the river and the canal, Delaware and Hudson Canal in Westfall or Deer Park. And the right-hand side is a picture of it, probably when it still had its wooden roof, or a drawing. The last covered bridge on the Delaware was the Portland-Columbia Bridge. It stayed in place until 1955. At that point, it had been turned into a pedestrian bridge. And the floods of August 18th and 19th, they were the 100-year flood. They caused mass destruction on the river in neighboring towns. There were a number of deaths from the flooding. The Portland-Columbia Bridge was lost in the flood. And these pictures I'm showing here, they're from a special booklet that was printed by the Easton Express, which it was just a horrific flood. And they have a lot of stuff in here. There was a guy who showed up, a local photographer, Al Niddle, and he actually has pictures of the bridge going in the river. And on the right-hand side is the process of the bridge. It was basically split in half, and it goes into the river and then goes onto the side of the river. The left-hand side is the Northampton Street Bridge, which shows you the extent of the destruction of the storm. That obviously was rebuilt. The decision was made not to rebuild the covered bridge, probably for economic reasons, since it was a pedestrian bridge and you couldn't really replicate it anyway. And what I want to end this brief talk is what is the legacy of the covered bridges on the Delaware River and Bucks County and Northampton and Pike and Wayne. It had the second covered bridge in the U.S. in Trenton, Morrisville. It had the third covered bridge east and a really historically significant bridge. Louis Vernwag's bridge was very innovative and kind of foreshadowed a lot of railroad bridge design work with its use of the wrought iron and the wood. It greatly facilitated commerce between the states, and not just New Jersey, also New York, upstate. And before they had covered bridges, you had to basically either take the ferry, row across the bridge or something. And it would take you 2 days to get from Philadelphia to New York because of the lack of bridges. And the wooden bridges were innovative because they're relatively affordable. They could be deployed where ferry spots were. It just brought livestock commerce back and forth between New Jersey and Pennsylvania, helped all the towns out greatly. And they were often associated with canals, and the combination of the canals and the bridges were basically the interstate highways until the railroads came into prominence in the 1840s and 1850s. So it's an important part of our heritage, important part of our economic history, actually. And to me, it's just a really fascinating topic in history because of how there's always a story with a covered bridge. And they're actually fairly well documented because even back in the 1850s, people like to take pictures of covered bridges. They still do today. And we have a lot of evidence about a lot of these lost bridges. Today, if you come down my way in Bucks County, we'll be happy to see you at the Bucks County Covered Bridge Society. We do have 12 covered bridges. My bridge in Perkasie is not currently really visible at the moment, The other 11 are mostly accessible except for Town, which is a seasonal bridge. And this map location shows that you still have 4 to 6 in close proximity to the Delaware River. And it's definitely worth a trip. Hopefully the leaves will be changing next week up there, if not already. And it's really worth a drive for you if you're not from the area. And my group, the Covered Bridge Society, we were formed in 2007 to help the rehabilitation of Moods Covered Bridge in East Rock Hill Township. And what we do is we raise awareness of preservation. We talk a lot with the county and the state about ways to either repair the bridges or we alert them to problems. And we do other preservation work, which we think is important because the county and the state can only do so much. It's really up to the locals to maintain awareness of the covered bridges. And that's kind of the mandate of our nonprofit. So that's my basic presentation. And I'd be happy to take any questions you would have about covered bridges.
Well, thank you so much, Scott. Greatly enjoyed learning more about these bridges. Okay, the Q&A disappeared. Okay, there it is, sorry. What are the remaining covered bridges still in use today?
Well, we have Pennsylvania has 215, I believe. We have 12 in Bucks County. Lancaster has 28. Chester has 15. Some they share with Lancaster County. And Pennsylvania we have the most covered bridges of any state in the country. Pennsylvania has more covered bridges than all of New England. So we basically have 24% of the covered bridges in America and Pennsylvania.
Wow, who knew? That's
Yeah, a lot of it's because preservation really happened early in the 1950s here for a lot of reasons. And especially in Bucks County, they kind of caught the fever of cultural tourism in the 1960s.
Yeah, it's wonderful. I'm glad they did. All right, so next question. Did I read someplace about a covered bridge that is in private hands with limited access, or is that in Vermont?
There are several. There's one. Well, it depends. Like a historic covered bridge. I'm sure there are people who may have them. I know of at least 2. I'm not going to say where they are since they're in private hands, but yes, that is true.
Okay. And then another question is, how about New Jersey?
New Jersey has one covered bridge, a Green Surgeons covered bridge, and that's over in Surgeonsville. And that was almost lost in the late 1950s. There was a fight between the local governments who wanted modern bridges and the preservationists. And the Green Surgeon Bridge was not only on a hit list in Hunterdon County, they actually took it apart and put it into storage. And the local residents talked to their state rep in New Jersey and their state senator, and they had the state legislature pass a law banning the demolition of the bridge and forced the hand of Hunterdon County, and they reached a compromise. Hunterdon County agreed to rehabilitate the covered bridge, and then the state said they would build a second covered bridge to go around it, so they have a 2-way bridge system. So if you go there now, there's the old bridge, and there's a second bridge on the side, so one each is different directions. But they are down to one official bridge. I think there's one outside of Philadelphia that may or may not be a real covered bridge, but officially there's only one covered bridge in New Jersey.
Yeah, that one was neat. I didn't know that they had disassembled it, but I did walk across it once and I'm looking at it going, okay, covered bridge and then a separate lane for another bridge.
That was a 3-year fight, and it got pretty ugly because the county commissioners they didn't care, and the fact that they went around the county commissioners and convinced the state elected officials to actually pass the statute saying they had to restore the covered bridge. It was pretty unusual.
Yeah. Okay, what was the primary wood source for the early bridges?
Well, basically, the early bridges, they were built with green wood, so they may have been local. Unfortunately, in Pennsylvania, a lot of Pennsylvania was deforested by the 1840s and 1850s because it was like the top lumber producer, but they wouldn't replant trees. So for our area, the lumber probably would have come from Potter County or Tioga down the river. And when Burr did his bridges, he actually owned a sawmill in New York and had his wood brought down the Susquehanna to do it. But it would have been local until probably the 1840s or 1850s. Then there would not have been a local supply unless you're up in upstate Pennsylvania.
Okay, is it true that it's a tradition to kiss under a covered bridge?
No, you would kiss inside a covered bridge. You wouldn't go under a covered bridge.
Stand under the stand and
That's what
sleep.
there's a certain covered bridge myth. One is the crybaby bridge myth, which is now kind of in vogue, about a woman who was distraught, threw a baby off the bridge and hanged herself, and then you can hear them screaming in the bridge. That was kind of a made-up tale from the 1970s. The kissing bridge thing, that's goes back a long time as kind of the folklore thing. The other thing is was a place where kids played hooky all the time from school. But they were used as shelter if you were in a storm and traveling and you had to, go someplace and were on the road. But yes, I think that's probably the most common tale about bridges is the kissing bridge thing.
It's funny you mentioned Crybaby Bridge because I was going to ask about that since it is close to Halloween. That was the Van Sant Bridge, right? Or was that a myth for a few different bridges? It was a
That's
pretty common
fantastic.
myth.
I actually did an interview with Action News
Mhm.
3 weeks ago, and they ran the story 2 days ago. So I can
Oh,
send you the
that's
link
just
for
really
that.
neat.
And they came out and interviewed us and everything. Van
Wow.
Sant's bridge is different because we don't know whether it's a crybaby, but there was a fatality on the bridge in 1918
Mhm.
where two men were in a tandem truck. They're driving over the bridge, and the truck went through the deck of the bridge, and the one guy was killed. He was pinned in the water by a plank from the bridge, and that's pretty well documented. But there's a lot of folklore about bridges in general.
Yeah, there is. Do you have a sense of why Palmer stopped being a bridge builder? Was there a reputational issue with his bridges?
His bridges are outstanding. They weren't cheap. No, I think he was offered this government service job up in New England, and he did repair a bridge after that. He repaired one of his prior bridges, and he went back and he became like back then, if you were like the collector of anything, it was a lucrative job. So I think he had a better job opportunity up back in New England. But there was one bridge he did which did not stand up well, I think, but the rest of them were pretty solid.
Okay. Does anybody else have any questions? I'll give you a minute to type it in before we wrap things up. Okay, I'm not seeing anything new. All right, well, Scott, thank you very much. We greatly enjoyed your information about the bridges and really appreciate your research and the photos and the stories about them.
Thanks for having me, and I definitely will be on your trail system doing stuff. So
Wonderful. Yeah, get out there. Oh, there is a question I missed. I am so sorry. Uh, okay, there's actually a few. I am sorry, everybody.
that's okay. It's still early.
Yeah. Okay. There was a covered bridge in Regalsville, PA from 1837 to 1903,
Right.
destroyed by the Pumpkin Flood. It was replaced
Yes.
by a unique cable suspension bridge built by John Roebling and Sons. It opened in 1904. Sorry, April 18th, 1904.
I
Uh,
spoke for Roebling 2 years ago on there's on Roebling bridges in Bucks County, and also I did a thing about their pedestrian bridges. And that was a great bridge, and it was interesting because that was lost in the flood. It was still owned by the privately held company, and they were in a dispute about paying the bill because they thought Roebling wasn't qualified after they did the job. And they basically got Roebling, what Roebling was qualified actually. It was one of the sons who did it. And they did some repair work on it because it was Benjamin Fackenthal actually who thought it wasn't done correctly. They were actually short on money, so they were trying to find a way to do it. And that was the constant thing with these privately held bridges is they would do great until there was a flood, and then they would go out and have to hustle up more shares. But at that point in 1903, especially with motorized vehicles uh, being more in vogue, it wasn't really practical to build new covered bridges because they couldn't handle the stress of the traffic. And eventually what happened is the two states got together, New Jersey and Pennsylvania. they set up a commission to form a commission to start the process of acquiring these bridges and making them toll free. And that took until the mid 1930s.
And one last one. Have you toured the covered bridges in Indiana? Do you know of any connections between the ones here?
I have not. It's on my to-do list. I've been to Ohio, and Ohio is interesting. If you go up to Erie and go into Ostabilla County, there's roughly 18 bridges. It's a big Mennonite area, and they are like our bridges basically. And Indiana has, Park County is one of the best places in the country to see bridges. They have a lot. Pennsylvania has a lot. There's really 6 different zones where there's bridges in Pennsylvania, and between Lancaster and Chester, Columbia, Montour, Northumberland. I've been up there. I've done most of those bridges. There's more than enough in Pennsylvania to keep you occupied if you want to do more than 200 bridges in like a year or two.
Yeah, that'll definitely keep you occupied.
Yeah, and they're always in interesting areas, and some are way back in the woods, and some are where you would not expect them. But we also have bridges, Lehigh County. Chester is an excellent bridge area, and I would highly recommend that. An easy drive to go out to Lancaster the back way through Chester, and you can make a couple of days out of it and just take your time.
Yeah, it's a very pretty drive. Okay, now I don't see any more questions. It's official.
Okay.
So we'll wrap this up, and thank you very much again, Scott. There's a few people sending their thank yous in chat. And oh, what is the name of your book? That just came in.
It's called Wooden Treasures: The History of Bucks County's Covered Bridges. It's on Amazon. I had been doing another publisher, basically, and it's a lot of obviously you need to like covered bridges, but it's got a lot of stuff in it, and I think it's it's presented in a way where there's a lot of pictures, and a picture's worth 1,000 words, and covered bridges have always, ever since people have had cameras, they've been out snapping pictures of covered bridges, and I have a lot of stuff that are rare pictures that I got from Mercer Museum and other sources. So I think if you're interested, check it out, and it's more important to come in Bucks County and see our existing bridges to support them, to me.
Absolutely. Okay, so now I don't see any more questions. Thank you for presenting. Learned a lot about the bridges. Thank you, everybody, for attending our lecture, and we'll close this out.
Okay,
Have
thanks.
a great night.
Thank you.